Boker Tov. Every generation and its expositors, every generation and its sages, every generation and its leaders, a famous Pitgam from Avodah Zarah, folio 5a. And we might add every generation and its halachic challenges. There is no doubt that the problem of Agunot, or chained women, whose husbands refuse to give them a get, is one of the most serious halachic problems of our time. From the Talmudic period until the 19th century, Jewish communities were autonomous with authoritative batei din, which were not afraid to wield their authority. When a woman requested a divorce and the husband refused for the sake of revenge or extortion, the batei din and the Jewish community knew how to make the husband cooperate. In modern times, a new problem arose of Agunot, who waited for years for their husbands to give them a get. Paradoxically, this crisis arose for opposite reasons in Israel and the diaspora. In the diaspora, a husband gives a civil divorce to his wife and sees no need to give her a get according to Jewish law. After the civil divorce is granted, he leaves the city or ignores his wife, and she can wait for years to get a get to no avail. In Israel, on the other hand, the sole authority regarding marriage and divorce was granted to the rabbinic courts by the law in 1953. In time, husbands began to extort large sums of money from their wives in order to give them a get. The monopoly of rabbinic courts on the one hand, and the yirat hora'ah, or fear of rendering a decision, of the judges on the other, gave the husbands tremendous power to extort their wives. The judges drag a case out for years for lack of ability to find a halachic solution to the problem, or they counsel the wife to pay off the husband, or to give them the apartment or custody of the children in order to release herself from her chains. As a result of all of the above, thousands of Jewish women in Israel and the diaspora wait years for a get. In other words, paradoxically, the Agunot problem exists in the diaspora precisely because there is civil divorce, while it exists in Israel precisely because there is not. Now, I'm not going to talk very much about the conservative Masorti solutions to this problem in Israel today, simply because I think I will run out of time at the end. My primary focus is going to be on the way that the conservative movement in North America dealt with the Agunot issue from 1930 until today, including some 40 years of active discussions and debates within the conservative movement. And by the way, if I pause at any time during this conversation, it's because my talk is written in Hebrew and I'm translating as I'm going along. I think that one can say without any hesitation that the subject of Agunot within the conservative movement became an obsession of conservative rabbis, at least for the 40 years under discussion from 1930 until 1970. And I think there were two reasons for that obsession. The first was the ethical problem. The fact that innocent women were chained to their husbands, could not get a get, could not remarry. This bothered many of the conservative rabbis during those 4 decades, and they felt that ethics is a very integral part of Judaism, and certainly of conservative Judaism, and is not being dealt with in the proper fashion from a halachic point of view. And furthermore, I think that they felt that this problem of the Agunot, of the women who cannot remarry, shows the ability or the inability of halakha to deal with a crucial modern problem. And since the conservative movement felt that halakha must deal with modern problems, we cannot sit on our hands or sit on the side and say that there is no halachic solution to this ethical problem and to this modern problem. And indeed, the second point was emphasized by Rabbi Theodor Friedman in 1952. I'm going to refer many times to this volume. I edited a 3-volume work that's called Proceedings of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, 1927 to 1970. It's a mouthful. For short, PCGLS, 1927 to 1970. The entire second volume of this collection of responsa is devoted to the subject of Agunot, or to put it differently, some 1/3 of the halachic responsa written by the conservative movement between 1927 and 1970 were devoted to the subject that I am discussing today. So once I had edited the book and published it, it was much easier to come to some conclusions about this period under discussion vis-a-vis the subject of Agunot. So to get back to my quote, Rabbi Theodor Friedman said in 1952, "We recognize, of course, that it is not the Agunot who is waiting for our decision. It is rather that our own profession of the adequacy of historic Judaism for modern life importunately waits to be squared with the facts. If we fail to make Judaism as expressed, at least in its procedure for divorce, accord with our deepest sense of justice and equity, we shall permanently become spiritual schizophrenics who talk one way and feel quite another. From such fate may the good Lord deliver us." In other words, it's not just the subject of Agunot itself, but the ability of halakha to deal with this modern problem that was troubling Rabbi Friedman in 1952. And indeed, if you go through this volume, you see that over the course of years, the subject of the Agunot dilemma became a subject of black humor among rabbis of the Rabbinical Assembly. And thus, for example, in 1960, we have the words of Rabbi Max Rutenberg. "It is 30 years now that it has been on the agenda of the Assembly, and it has not been disposed of as of yet. It was an issue which at times raised the hopes of the membership that at long last a major breakthrough in the wall of cautious conservatism was being effected, and at times plunged the Rabbinical Assembly into despair of utter hopelessness and futility. In a sense, it had the qualities of a tragic love affair. We are tempted to say that history and literature have given us no more poignant and searing story. Samson had his Delilah, Caesar had his Cleopatra, Romeo his Juliet, and the Rabbinical Assembly its Agunot." This type of black humor appears quite a few times in this volume. Similarly, Rabbi Ralph Simon said in 1968, and this was after the fourth solution that I'm going to present in my talk was approved by the Rabbinical Assembly, he said, "We have been determined to offer solutions to the Agunot problem. When I came to my first Rabbinical Assembly convention as a newly ordained rabbi over 35 years ago, I met the young Agunot for the first time. Since then, she married without our blessing, and her grandchildren are now members of our congregations." So again, he was expressing the frustration that after all the debates and discussions, the Rabbinical Assembly was finally finding a solution, or at least a partial solution, with the T'nai B'Kiddushin, the conditional marriage decided upon in 1968. Originally, when I wrote and talked about this subject, I was simply going to survey the halachic solutions, as they say in Hebrew, neto, right? Simply look at the halachic solutions in and of themselves, without considering the political, sociological, and psychological factors. After studying this material, I realized that regarding this topic, it is impossible to divorce, excuse the expression, to divorce the halakha from the politics and the sociology and the psychology. I think that the three solutions that were eventually adopted and utilized by the conservative movement were adopted not because they were necessarily the best solutions to the problem, but for an amalgam of factors having to do with politics, sociology, and psychology. And indeed, Rabbi Louis Epstein, and Ben Steiner is going to talk about him at length after I mention him briefly, Rabbi Louis Epstein, who spent 19 years of his life, the last 19 years of his life, publishing and arguing and cajoling about this problem, he wrote to Boaz Cohen in 1935. Boaz Cohen, Boaz Cohen was one of the leading halachic authorities of the conservative movement between 1930 and his death in 1969. Louis Epstein wrote to Boaz Cohen in 1935, "I do not think that the halakha of the case is going to decide whether our proposal will be accepted or not. If we yield, it will not be for halachic reasons, but because of weakness of our organization and movement." In other words, he understood that his solution for the Agunot problem, which I will present in a moment, would not be accepted on its halachic merits, but on whether there was the political will to do it and have it accepted, or to do it even if it wasn't accepted by Orthodox rabbis. So I would like to survey the 5 halachic solutions that were proposed, and as I said, 3 of them were ultimately accepted, by conservative rabbis between 1930 and 1970. The first is the solution of Rabbi Louis Epstein, who lived from 1887 to 1949, born in Lithuania, studied at the Slobodki Yeshiva until 1904 when he and his family moved to the United States, ordained by JTS in 1913, received a doctorate from JTS in 1921, and was the well-known rabbi of KI of Kilat Israel in Brookline, Massachusetts from 1925 to 1947. In addition, he was the president of the Rabbinical Assembly from 1922 to 25, an active member of the Law Committee, including a number of years as the chair, and he was involved in the Law Committee from 27 until 1940. He was a real expert on the subject of marriage law in Judaism. His 5 primary publications, his 5 books, are all on the subject of marriage and divorce in Judaism, and I'm not going to list the titles for lack of time. In 1930, he published this booklet. It's not a Xerox, this is the original. Hatza'ah leman takanat Agunot, a suggestion for fixing the situation, solving the situation of Agunot. And what he suggested there is that the rabbi who is performing the Kiddushin, the marriage ceremony, should at the same time prepare a shtar minui shlichut, and if you look at the source sheet in front of you, it's source number 1 Aleph, a shtar minui shlichut, in which at the time of the wedding, the husband, the groom, appoints his wife, lichtov get la'atzmech bifnei beit din ploni, that she can write a get for herself in front of a beit din. And he will give her power and authority, l'shliach lo lacha, until the final deliverer of the get. And the key phrase is on the left-hand column in the Hebrew, raku ba'ofen shime azovet ishti, that if I leave my wife, o shelo afarnasena, or that I will not sustain her for 3 years in a row, or that there will be a civil divorce, and I take upon myself b'shvuat Torah, with a Torah oath, shelo levatel lo et haget velo et hashluchim, not to do away with or dissolve the get or the shluchim, those who deliver the get, etc., etc. In other words, that this provision will take effect if I do not. If I leave my wife, or if I do not give her sustenance for 3 years, or if I give her a civil get and do not civil divorce and do not give her a get. He concluded this booklet with a paragraph which can leave no doubt as to his respect for Orthodox rabbis and traditional Jewish law. And I'm not going to translate this into English because that would take 10 minutes. The Hebrew is beautiful. והנני כותב כל אלו הדברים רק כשואל ולא כמשיב, ועל תנאי שיסכימו גדולי ההוראה בכל תפוצות ישראל. ואני כתלמיד דל הערך, שמתהווה להתאבק באפר רגליהם של נושאי דגל התורה. ולא באתי להרים ראש נגד המסורה והקבלה, אפילו כקוצו של יוד, ולא להקל חס וחלילה נגד איזה פוסק, או אפילו תלמיד תלמידו. ומקווה אנוכי שגדולי הוראה יתעמקו בעניין זה וירחיבו את גבולו, עד שתצא הוראה מפיהם כיום נתינתה מהר סיני. ואני תפילה שיהיה חלקי עם אלו שמשתתפים בצערם של בנות ישראל, ומבקשים להן דרור מכבלי העיגון בכוח המאור שבתורתנו הקדושה. What he's saying is that I am not coming here to rebel against anyone. I do not question any Orthodox rabbi's authority. I want to do this within the traditional framework entirely. My only goal is to help the Agunot. As we will see in a few moments, Esad Gornish geholfen, Zelo Azar Bichlal. This did not help at all. He was viewed by Orthodox rabbis as a terrible rebeller against Orthodox Judaism. Rabbi Epstein, apparently at his own expense, this I have not checked, sent out 1,000 copies of this booklet to 1,000 rabbis throughout the world. And in 1935, he further refined his Hatza'ah, and he added suggestions of Rabbi Ben Zion Alkalai of Jerusalem from 1912, as well as members of the Conservative Movement's Law Committee, that in addition to appointing the wife, the husband could also appoint other shlichim bichtav, other people who could serve as the shaliach for the get at the time of the kiddushin. Even though, and later on, Rabbi Epstein published this entire book, the Shelat Agunot, in 1940, as you can see, an entire hardcover book, 270 pages devoted to this solution that he is proposing. Despite his efforts for all of those years, his suggestion was never accepted by the Rabbinical Assembly of the Conservative Movement. I believe there were 5 reasons for this, and I'm sure that Ben will have more to say on this subject. Number 1, there was tremendous opposition from the Orthodox rabbinate to his solution. They even published an entire book, which I do not have the original of, but this is a Xerox of that book. It's called Ledor Acharon. I would say the easiest way to define this book is 114 pages of invective. It is an extremely nasty book. Almost none of it has to do with what the halachic solution that he proposed. There are only 3 short sections in this book that actually discuss his halachic solutions. Most of it is simply venom against Rabbi Epstein. How dare he and these upstart conservative rabbis propose this solution. Number 2, Rabbi Epstein and the members of the Rabbinical Assembly were waiting for the support of Professor Louis Ginsburg to this solution, which eventually was not forthcoming. Number 3, there was internal opposition to Rabbi Epstein's proposal within the RA. Number 4, Rabbi Epstein himself did not want to oppose the Orthodox rabbis. Number 5, and I think number 5 was very important, was the psychological aspect. You're asking a couple right before their marriage ceremony to set up the mechanism of their divorce. There were many people who were opposed to that idea. The second solution that was proposed was by Rabbi Michael Higger and Rabbi Solomon Faber. You may have never heard of those 2 rabbis, which I believe is the reason that the solution was not accepted. And they said in 1950 and 1952 respectively that the Beit Din can lafkia takidushin, can annul the marriage, provided that under the chuppah, when you have the marriage ceremony, you don't just say Hariat Mekudeshet Li Kedat Moshe Yisrael according to the law of Moses in Israel, but also Al Dat Beit Din, according to the will of the Beit Din, or Kedat Beit Din Shel Knesset HaRabbanim. And they give halachic reasons why by adding that phrase, and I don't have the time to explain this, why by adding that phrase they then give the Beit Din the authority to annul the marriage should no divorce be forthcoming. The third solution, which was accepted and is still in use, despite the fact that it has proved to be legally totally ineffective, is the Lieberman Clause, proposed by Rabbi Professor Saul Lieberman at the Rabbinical Assembly Convention of 1953, the original suggestion, and actually adopted in 1954 with the wording of the Ketubah. This solution was not only proposed and written by Professor Lieberman, but it was pushed vociferously by Professor Louis Finkelstein, who was certainly the most important leader of the conservative movement at the time. Professor Finkelstein talked of this solution in hyperbolic terms, which again I don't have time to read right now, but Professor Finkelstein said that this solution was on the par of the work of the Tanaim, such as Hillel, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and Rabbi Eliezer, and that not only will it put us, the Rabbinical Assembly, on the map of the world, but also on the map of history. And what the Lieberman Clause said was that should there be a disagreement between the couple, i.e. that the husband refuses to give the wife a get, they will go to the Beit Din of the Rabbinical Assembly, the conservative movement, and listen to what they have to say. And the point of this clause was that this would be enforceable in secular courts. That was only tried once, to the best of my knowledge, in the Elitzur versus Elitzur case, which was totally inconclusive. It went through three judicial instances in the United States. On behalf, they ruled for the wife, they ruled for the husband, they ruled for the wife. It was clear after that episode, which took years, that the Lieberman clause would be totally ineffectual in forcing the husband to give the wife a get. So why is it still in use? And on the page in front of you, on the source sheet in front of you, the Lieberman clause is on the source 3 Aleph, and there are also English translations available. The reason it's still in use by conservative rabbis, especially since 1991, which is source 3 Bet, is because of the letter of intent on the left. The purpose was to bring psychological pressure to bear on the couple to understand that this legal document, the Lieberman clause within the Ketubah, has validity and needs to be taken into consideration upon them reaching a state where they want to get divorced. As I said, the Lieberman clause did not work from a secular point of view. It also really had little effect in general because it could take years for such a thing to work its way through the courts. Why was it accepted? It was accepted due to the authority of Professor Lieberman and Professor Finkelstein. And that's why it's still in use until today, so many years later. The fourth solution that was adopted by the Rabbinical Assembly was the Kiddushin al T'nai, conditional marriage, adopted in 1968. It had first been suggested in 1930 and in 1938. It was adopted in 1968. It says, and that's the last page on the source sheet in front of you, source 4. It says here anti-nuptial agreement. That's A-N-T-E, not A-N-T-I. I think is a poor choice of terminology. It's a prenuptial agreement. The point of this agreement is very, very simple. It says that if there's a civil divorce and within 6 months the husband refuses to give his wife a get, that the kiddushin are dissolved milachatchila, that they never happened. And this is based on a tshuva of Rabbi Yisrael Bruna from the 15th century, a takana of the rabbis of France in 1907, a takana of the rabbis of Turkey in 1924, a book by Aleph Chet Freiman in 1945, and a book by Professor Eliezer Berkowitz in 1966. It is no coincidence that this was adopted by the Rabbinical Assembly in 1968. Clearly, they read Rabbi Berkowitz's book carefully. He was, of course, an Orthodox rabbi. They were the only ones who actually adopted what he said. The Orthodox rabbis would not do what Rabbi Berkowitz suggested. The conservative rabbis adopted his solution, and it is in wide use until today. And finally, the most radical solution is hafka'ah, is to annul a marriage if the husband refuses to give the wife a divorce. First suggested in 1951 by Rabbi David Aronson, suggested at length by Rabbi Simon Greenberg in 1970 in an article which is 70 pages long. And it was finally implemented by the Joint Beit Din of the Conservative Movement in 1991 under the leadership of Rabbi Professor Meir Rabinowitz, who is still the head of the Joint Beit Din of the Conservative Movement. This means that if after giving a civil divorce and discussions with the husband, including a letter, or if the husband is trying to extort the wife, or if the husband is violent, or if the husband disappears, then the rabbi, the local rabbi, brings the case to the Joint Beit Din, and they do hafka'at kiddushin, an annulment of the marriage based on a Talmudic principle. This has been in 1991. Some 30 to 40 hafka'ot, or annulments of marriages, are performed by the Joint Beit Din every year, which may not seem like a lot, but if you multiply that by the years since 1991, you're talking about up to 1,000 women who were saved from a situation of being agunot by the use of the hafka'ah solution. To summarize, these were 5 solutions proposed and discussed at length by conservative rabbis between 1930 and 1970. Ultimately, 3 of those solutions were accepted. The Lieberman clause, which apparently only has psychological benefit, the Kiddushin al Tnai, the conditional marriage from 1968, and Hafkat Kiddushin, the annulment of marriages from 1991. So from the point of view of the conservative movement outside of Israel, the Agunot problem, dilemma, has at long last been solved after these decades of debates and discussions. Thank you very much. Toda rabah.